This is lesson 25 for chapter 25 on the perfect tense. The goals for this lesson are obviously to learn the forms of the perfect tense, to learn all about the perfect tense. Also to learn the rules for reduplication. We'll explain that when we get to it. And then we're going to go into further depth about the middle voice. Before we talk about the perfect, I just want to once again go into a little bit of review about the two elements that a verb contains in the indicative mood. Now, in the indicative mood, a verb will have both time and time and aspect. Time and aspect are both elements of tense. Often in English, when we talk about tense, we're talking about time. But in Greek, tenses convey more than just time, they convey aspect as well. When it comes to time, the time element, we're talking a verb tense can have either past or non-past. So we mentioned this already. The past time can be imperfect, it can be aorist, and it can be pluperfect, which is one that we haven't learned yet, but we will learn in the future. And then non-past time. So past time, of course, is indicated by the past tense morpheme on the front. And then the lack of the past tense morpheme, this is just the lack of, the past tense morpheme will be your basic tenses, which are not indicated to be in the past. And those will include the present, the future, and the perfect. And finally, there is aspect. Now we remember this, that verbs contain both time and aspect. Now we outline three specific aspects: the imperfective, the perfective, and then what we're going to talk about today as the perfect. Now the imperfective, we talked about it in terms of the internal temporal development. And in the imperfective, we can see the internal developing, the continuation of the action. But what we emphasized was that the action itself is not complete. The perfective, however, looks at the whole, does not focus on the internal, but focuses externally, and does emphasize a completeness, not necessarily completed, but a completeness, where the imperfective aspect emphasizes incompleteness. So for instance, if we were doing our timeline that we had been focusing on, it looks something like this. So this is that action. Now the imperfective aspect is focused kind of internally, right? On stuff that is happening here, but it has not gotten to this part. The perfective is concerned about this as a singular whole. So this is, for instance, in the middle, I was drowning, but we haven't reached that end point. And this is, I drowned. Or, for instance, I was being baptized. It doesn't necessarily say whether that is complete or will not be complete or what, but the idea is it's something that is unfolding. Whereas the perfective aspect, right here, I was baptized. Simple external view of what happened rather than an internal view, and it's complete. So the imperfective, incomplete, the perfective, complete. And then finally we come to the perfect. So the perfect, as we noted, is actually focused at this point. Okay? So what that emphasizes is that we have a whole completed action. So there's this element of the perfective, but we're talking about this point in time where there isn't really a beginning or an end. And in that sense, it emphasizes the imperfective, kind of the ongoing nature of what's going on. Often, this includes a state. My pen is not writing great, but it includes a state. Or it includes the situation or the reality that is the outcome after this past action. So what we're looking at is two things. We're looking at the state in the present that was created by this past complete action, I have been saved. I'm in the state of being saved. The door has been shut. So if the door is shut, this is a complete idea, or just simply the state of affairs, which is a little bit different than saying something is in a state, though it might be nitpicky, that has happened after this. So I have heard is different than I heard, which just emphasizes this past action. I have heard emphasizes the present state of affairs after having heard, though it's not technically a new state. So again, whereas the imperfective emphasizes this internal action, and the perfective emphasizes this whole action, the perfect emphasizes a state after the complete action. With the perfect tense, this is the present. I have been saved. I have been baptized. You are in the state of having been baptized, though the action of baptizing happened in the past. And the saving, for instance, in that way would be understood to have happened in the past. The effects are in the present. The pluperfect, which we'll talk about in a much different time, actually this would be in the past, but the completed action would be even further in the past. That one doesn't occur too much. So kind of wrap your head around that, and we'll talk more about that as we go, even though this is a little bit of review. So different specific ways we can do this is this chart that we've seen, where we have the time and we have the aspect. Now, there are three different aspects and two different relations to time, and each of the tenses that we learn will relate to all of these. Now, the tense that we're going to learn today is the perfect. And the perfect is non-past, which is in most cases present. It's not marked for past tense. The pluperfect will be marked for happening in the past, so it's not marked for happening in the past. And it's in the perfect or combinatory or stative or retrospective, any of those aspect. That means it happens, we are dealing with the action after it has been completed, but focusing on the present. Great, so let's talk a little bit more about the perfect tense then. In the present, while we might have something like I loose or I am loosing, in the aorist, we might have something like, or I loosed. In the perfect, what we have is I have loosed. That emphasizes that it's at the present time. The time that we're focusing on is the present, but the action that we're talking about has already happened. So the loosing, so if this is where you are on this timeline, the action already happened back here. And we are dealing with the effects of that action. I have loosed. Now what that means, of course, is different with each particular type of action that the verb describes. But the issue is you are in a situation after the completion of that action. So the loosing happened back here, and I have loosed is up here. So you're in a situation where you've loosed. So for instance, Jesus died. That's a simple past event. That would be equivalent to what we would say is aorist or aoristic. But we say Jesus has died for our sins. That dying happened in the past, but the event is viewed from its effect on the present. So that's one way that you can see the perfect. So Jesus has died. The time is present, but the action happened in the past. It is completed, and that's part of the aspect. And so that's what we're talking about when we're talking about the perfect tense. This may seem a little bit obscure, but as we go through, we'll see how this can be pretty significant for your exegetical work. Let's also consider Mark 5:34. Ha de epenote thugater, hepistis su sesokense. Ha de epen Note this, by the way, that sometimes these articles can function as pronouns. So here, this is what we have. This is actually standing in for Jesus, he, and then we have the post positive, but he said to her, thugater. That is in the vocative, but he said to her, daughter, he pistis. So this is your nominative. Obviously, it is the subject of the verb. Su is modifying pistis. Your faith, sisoken, has saved you. Now, there's some question about what saving means here, because here it is a actual healing event. So it might be your faith has healed you, though it is from the word sozo, which means saved, but in Greek, and this is also important to know. So the Greek terminology for salvation, sozo, is not a one-to-one correspondence to what the modern conception of saved is. As a matter of fact, the modern conception of saved is dependent on hundreds of years of kind of discursive thinking about what it means to be religious and what religious salvation entails. But the word saved in ancient Greek carries with it a holistic kind of amalgamation of both physical and spiritual realities. As a matter of fact, those things are not so divorced as they are in modern conceptions. That saying, saved could mean a lot of things. Here, the focus is on the completed action. But when has the completed action occurred? That's not the issue. The issue is that salvation has occurred. You have been saved. Of course, it is with faith and her approaching in faith. And as we have mentioned before, faith here is not just rational belief, but is an embodied reality. But have saved. So your faith has saved. The action is completed, but that salvation obviously has continuing ongoing effects. That state of that salvation, that completed action, results in what we experience in the present. And so that's what's happening for this thugater, this daughter. This is important. These are important exegetical decisions to be making, important exegetical conceptions to get at, but a lot of that is not going to come across so freely in English. A lot of it has to be explained in the sense of the grammar. So Andy said to her, daughter, your faith has saved you, or as some translations have it, your faith has healed you. Sesoken. Notice here that, by the way, you'll see that this is interesting. Notice here there's two articles. The reason that there's two articles here is that se throws back its article. And so that's what's happening right there. Because these are meant to be read together. So don't worry about it. There are actual rules why those articles are there, and though we don't know most of those rules. So sesoken, perfect active indicative, third person singular from sozo, he, she, it, has saved. So your faith has saved you. The formation of the perfect. So we know we've gotten the general sense of what the perfect means, but we need to talk a little bit about the formation of the perfect itself. The formation of the perfect is taken with the perfect tense stem. With that, the beginning of that tense stem is what we call reduplicated. The original initial letter sound of that word is repeated with a epsilon. So it's kind of a stuttering at the beginning, and we'll show you that when we get there. There is an infix or a suffix, I guess. So after the stem, you add a kappa, and then after that kappa, you add the perfect verb endings. So consider the active verb lelukas. We begin with le, or lu, our tense stem, because again, lu has a common tense stem throughout every tense. And then we have reduplication. Now, reduplication is you take this initial sound and you do it again at the beginning, and then you add a epsilon here. So it's epsilon reduplication. And so that will happen with every perfect, that there will be some form of reduplication at the beginning. Then you add kappa and your ending, right? So reduplication, kappa, ending. So let's do that. Let's look at the paradigm and learn it. We start out with our tense stem. We add the reduplication. Just like past time has the epsilon on the front, the perfect aspect is defined by a reduplication. It's all the perfect aspect is defined by this sort of reduplication at the beginning. Add your kappa, and then we have our endings. A, leluka, I have loosed. As, lelukas, you have loosed. En, leluken, he, she, it has loosed. Amen, lelukamen, we have loosed. Notice have here, not had. So not had. And the reason that it's not had is that is a past perfect. So that's what we would call pluperfect. It's important that you do I have and not I had. Has, because that's talking about what you have in the present, right? So it's talking about that's the aspect that is the present effects. At least that's how we try to convey it in English. Ate, lelukate, you all have loosed. Asi, or asin, lelukasin, they have loosed. So these endings should all look pretty familiar to you. They look a lot like your aorist endings. This one is a little bit different, and you have your kappas, which is different. So the kappas often will give away the perfect, and the reduplication definitely always gives away perfect aspect. Okay, so be aware of the kappas and the reduplication as characteristic of the perfect. And these endings should be pretty easy for you because they're kind of a play on what we have done already, although this third person plural is a little bit different. Sometimes, however, the third person plural fits closer with the aorist pattern by being con instead. Obviously, with the aorist, it's son, right? So that'll happen. It's only 9 times in the New Testament that happens, but I think that you will be able to recognize it when it happens. So memorize all of those. Now, I want to talk a little bit about reduplication. Normally, reduplication follows a pretty simple rule, right? So letters like P, you have P, pistuken, right? So you have pistu, and so in order to form it, you just take that first P sound, and you put another P and an epsilon out front of that P, right? And so that'll happen with most letters, right? Se, right? Le, l, right? So you have that. That'll be easy to recognize. When it happens that way, that's the most standard way of seeing the reduplication, though with some letters it forms a little bit differently. So with our more breathier initial consonants, phi, chi, or theta, they kind of harden out a little bit. They solidify, right? And so they take away the breathiness. So instead of phi, you have p. Instead of chi, you have kappa. Instead of theta, you have t, right? Or tau. So you have that t sound, right? So something like therapeuo, right, adds to therapeuka, which sounds kind of gross, but to therapeuka, okay? So just be aware of that when you see it. The third way that reduplication happens is when it happens with a vowel or a diphthong at the beginning. What happens? Well, that vowel or that diphthong will lengthen. So we have agapao here, and now you have agapeka. So what you have is this alpha is automatically lengthens into that. Now, this, you may think, oh, well, how am I supposed to distinguish that from just the past tense morpheme, which will do the same thing? Well, you can distinguish it by this kappa ending. When you see that kappa, that's what tells you it's perfect in those instances. So this one might be a little bit more confusing, while the other two were pretty straightforward. But you get around it by noting the kappa ending. And then sometimes you will get verbs that begin with two consonants. The reduplication when you have two consonants is really just putting an epsilon on the front. We have that with gnoka. Gnoka is from gnosko. Now, that looks a lot like the past tense morpheme, so how are you going to be able to distinguish that from the aorist? Well, you're going to be able to distinguish it by the kappa. So you see that kappa, gnosko, doesn't normally have that kappa in the aorist. It doesn't have that kappa in the aorist. It'll have a sigma there. Here, however, we have a kappa, so that tells you that you have a perfect. So sometimes you're looking for the reduplication, sometimes you're looking for the kappa. Usually it's the reduplication and the kappa, but here it's just the one. Now let's look at the formation of the perfect middle passive. Again, there is one ending, just like with the present and the imperfect. There's one ending for the middle and the passive. Consider the perfect middle passive, which begins with your stem, lu, and then you have that same reduplication. What's interesting is that there is no kappa with the middle passive, but what we have instead is endings with no connecting vowel. So this is third person singular. If you were going to write just a single letter, instead of P, because we already have that for present, you could use T for perfect. That's what Mounce does. So perfect, middle passive, indicative, third person singular. These endings are pretty distinctive because of the lack of connecting vowel. So let's look at those endings and see how that goes. Again, no kappa though. So we begin with our stem. We add our reduplication, as you would expect with your perfect. And then you just add your endings. So I have been loosed. Psi, you have been loosed. Tai, he, she, it has been loosed. Metha, we have been loosed. Stha, y'all have been loosed. Ntai, they have been loosed. This, again, actually should be pretty easy for you to get down. And the reason that this should be easy for you to get down is that my sai tai, methastha entai, are technically the actual endings for the middle passive just without a connecting vowel. So you already know these. Instead of amitha or estha or untai, it's just methastha entai. So just memorize those without the connecting vowels. In my and tai, instead of amai or atai, you have my tai. Now, what's the one that's different is psi. And the reason that that's different is because there is morphologically what happens is there was a connecting vowel. This sigma doesn't like the connection between, or doesn't like being between two vowels like that. So it drops out, leaving you with epsilon, alpha, iota. That epsilon and that alpha combined, contract into an eta, and then that iota subscripts. And so that your typical passive ending looks like this. There are reasons for why it gets there. You don't have to memorize that thing I just said or the reasons that it's there. Just remember that for the middle passive, psi is your ending. So you can say my psi tai methastha ntai. That's actually something you could probably chant. The ntai is interesting. So my psi tai methastha ntai. My psi tai methastha ntai. My psi tai methastha ntai. Right? But you'll have that down because you know these endings already. So this should be real easy. The big thing that you need to know for the perfect middle passive is unlike the active, there's no kappa, but there is reduplication, and these endings are the same middle passive endings that you know already without the connecting vowels. Mounts, again, does this thing where he talks about, and this is based on older grammar, so it's not so much just from Mounts, but again, it's a title I don't like, but he talks about the second perfect. When we talk about the second perfect, it's not a different form of the perfect. It's not related to the second aorist. Those aren't related at all. But what it is instead is just like we saw with the aorist passive and the future passive, there are some forms where one of the letters drops out. Where in the future passive and the aorist passive, it was the theta that drops out. Here, sometimes the kappa drops out in the active, right? This doesn't happen in the middle of the passive because there is no kappa in the middle or the passive, so there's no place for it to drop out. So just be aware that a kappa might drop out, and a good clue on if a word is perfect, if the kappa has dropped out, still look for that reduplication. If that reduplication happens, but you don't have a kappa, good chance you have a perfect there. If you want to see more about this, go to Mounts, look at chapter 25, section 14, and he'll talk a little bit more about what he calls the second perfect. I won't be calling it that. I'll just be calling it a perfect with a kappa that drops out, because I think that is easier. I think it's less confusing. Great, so that is the perfect. We have finished with the perfect. That's all we want to talk about with the perfect. Let's talk now about the middle voice. As I promised earlier, I promised that we would discuss the middle voice a little bit more. Obviously, it has to mean something more than just an active translation, even though I'm having you translate all the middles just simply actively. And that's true. So the active voice is pretty straightforward. It's the subject that does the action of the verb. The passive voice, the action of the verb is done to the subject. And the middle voice, this is what the middle voice's unique contribution is. The action of the verb is done by the subject, like the active, but also somehow it affects the subject. So there's some sort of self-interest or something else that comes back on the subject. So the subject is still in view with the completion of the action. We don't have something like this in Greek or in English. So it makes it hard for us to conceptualize it, but it is there in Greek. And as a matter of fact, a lot of Greek scholars believe that the middle voice actually predated the passive voice, and the passive voice came out of the middle. So that's interesting to think about. So let's talk about two major categories and overall three uses of the middle that I want you to be aware of. And I do want you to be aware of this, so write these down. The indirect middle. The subject of the in indirect middle, the subject does the action of the verb to a direct object, but the subject's participation is emphasized. This is handled in two ways. One, there's an emphatic use. So the indirect, an emphatic middle. I myself loosed, or you yourself loosed. So emphasis on the subject himself is the one, or herself is the one doing these things. Or self-interest, which is a less likely use of the middle. I loosed for myself. You loosed for yourself. So you're doing it for, right? So that's the self-interest element of it. This is one of the least likely ones to be used. And then there is the reflexive direct middle. So this is the second major category. The subject does the action of the verb and also receives the action of the verb. So whereas the indirect middle was just talking about how the original subject was part of the action or how it related to that person, here in the reflexive use, the actual action is being done back to the original subject by the subject. So that's why it's reflexive. So you have something like, I loose myself, or you wash yourself, or they untied themselves. Those are the nuances of the reflexive direct middle. So ultimately, I want you to know three different uses. The emphatic, the reflexive, and the middle of self-interest. So the emphatic middle, the reflexive middle, and the middle of self-interest. And it can be pretty much summed up in this small chart that we have here. I myself loosed, emphatic. I loosed myself, reflexive. Or I loosed for myself, self-interest, right? So at the end of the day, these are the three that I want you to remember: emphatic, reflexive, self-interest. Many times the simple active equivalent, however, is enough, so you don't really need to think about it too much. But sometimes you do want to wonder, why is that middle there, right? So sometimes if there is a middle there, you want to know, why did the author choose middle when they could have chosen an active voice? Or a passive voice, I guess. But when they could have just selected an active voice, why did they choose the middle? Great. And so we are done with indicative verbs. That's it. Now, we haven't gone over the pluperfect tense, but we'll address that a little bit further down the line. It doesn't occur that often in the New Testament, and there are not a lot of, and there's not any a lot of discussion about it in Mounts. So what should we do at this point? Well, go to chapter 25 and look at section 21. Mounts there has some recommendations about further learning and things you should focus on in terms of Greek, the indicative verb, stuff like that. And also check out pages 370 to 380. There you'll find the verbs that occur most often, 50 times or more, in their different tense forms. You're going to want to go through and familiarize yourself with strange forms. The biggest variations will be in blue. So memorize those ones that are in blue. So for instance, they will be laid out in terms of principal parts. You might check that handout that I gave you on principal parts for a little bit more explanation. But principal parts will come in 6 different forms. So lambano, lampsamai, elabon, elepha, elemai, elephthane. Now, your first principal part will be your present endings, your present and imperfect. This will be future. This will be aorist, active, and middle. And then your 6 will be aorist or future passive. These 2 will be your perfect. So perfect active and perfect middle passive. Again, go back to the sheet on principal parts in order to understand that a little bit better, give you a little better explanation for that. But you'll notice that in some different tense forms, there will be strange variations. If you want to get ahead of those variations, make sure that you go through and you memorize the ones that are in blue. Those are the biggest variations, the ones that you need to know more. But that's it. We're done with indicative verbs, and we will be moving on to participles. And additionally, there's a couple other things you can check that will help you solidify the things that we've learned. Look on page 357. On 357, you'll see all the different forms of the different paradigms in luo. So that's the most stable verb. That'll give you the clearest indication of those endings and how they're formed. And then look at 360 through 369. There we find charts of other forms of the indicative, but of course avoid anything that has to do with stuff that we haven't covered, which includes athematic verbs. We won't focus on athematic verbs or me verbs until the end of the Mounts book. All right, and so that's it for the indicative.